early on, my approach was really to lean into the strengths-based concept. And positive self-identity was something that I still value a lot. And I think is the ultimate goal. And at the same time, my team lead here, who I work with, was really, we met early on and they reminded me that isn't possible for everybody. And it's not fair for everybody to push that kind of gaslighty wellness. Everything has to be good. And they really turned me on to this concept of neutral self-concept. And I think that ultimately that's the first step, is to remove judgment, to help them remove judgment from their actions, and then to frame how it's not wrong and how it's not broken. So some of that is sharing stories about my own life or sharing neutral stories about experiences of many neurodivergent people. I've always loved Barry Prezant's approach, who's an autism specialist, and I think his book is Thinking Differently, but I could be wrong. Anyway, but the point of his book is that really the characteristics in autism specifically that are pathologized are actually characteristics that you can find in almost every child. It's just that the specific presentation or duration of presentation ends up being pathologized. And then once it's pathologized, then every single time the child presents like that, it's a pathologization, whereas other children present in the exact same ways and it's not pathologized.
Hello again, and welcome back to the NITW Podcast. This is the program from Neurodiversity in the Workplace. We are a small neuroinclusion consultancy that works with businesses and job seekers with the mission of making a more neuroinclusive world of work. And today we are very delighted to have our very own colleague, Denielle Rose, here on the show to lend her insight and perspective from her particular line of work within our team. Really valuable perspective and experience that I think will be informative to all sides of our listeners, both on the corporate, on the job seeking, on the employee side. Yeah, super excited to have you here, Denielle. Let's start with just a little intro of who you are and what you do.
Yeah. My name is Denielle Rose. I will disclose that I'm autistic and ADHD. I'm a neurodiversity workplace coach here at Neurodiversity in the Workplace, and I'm a PhD candidate in critical psychology at Point Park University. Critical, not clinical, which analyzes systems that create pathology rather than individualized pathology.
Which, yeah, the systems part plays so much into what we do. So I really appreciate that distinction and yeah, what it brings to your perspective and what you do. So my hope with having you here on the show today was, I think, from where you sit, both in the academic space and particularly in your professional role, you have a really good window into what is on the mind of the neurodivergent workforce, what challenges, what struggles, what either external or internal people are finding challenging in this ever-changing professional and societal world that we're in. So I was hoping to start with just a big picture of like your observations over the last maybe 6 to 12 months, anything that stands out in terms of common themes that you find yourself providing coaching on. And yeah, what are those themes? What are people raising concerns about? And what has been your way of approaching those different topics?
Absolutely. I love that question because what I've noticed from when I first started coaching, I thought it would be a lot of executive functioning coaching, et cetera, which is great. But as a neurodivergent person, I know that I struggle with that too. But I started to get pretty surprised early on that really what I was finding is that a lot of my coaches anyway are asking about and seeing two trends. One is that they want to know more about themselves. Once they understand that I come from the lens of neuroinclusion and validation and really understand some of the ways, again, drawn from my degree, that the systems aren't always compatible with the ways that we are, helping develop frameworks of self-understanding that can lead into self-advocacy and identifying needs. So I get a lot of coaches actually wanting to know, how do you approach this problem from a neurodiversity affirming lens? I've always been told that I'm too much or I'm not doing it right or I'm lazy and I don't feel lazy. So what is it instead of, if it's not lazy, what is it? So that's one thing that I get a lot of, and those are fun exploratory sessions. Yeah. And I think we have a lot of fun, and I, learn a lot about what neuroinclusion really looks like and what self-understanding really looks like. The second thing that I'm seeing that I think needs a little bit more attention in the workplace, and I think just from neuroinclusion spaces in general, is that even as we educate corporate systems or even academic spaces around neuroinclusion, it doesn't change the fact that the individuals themselves have been raised in a pathological framework. They've been raised, either they knew that they were neurodivergent since they were a child, and most likely up until very recently, we're starting to see kids in this new generation, and still not the majority, have a more neuroaffirming self-identity. But most people in the workforce now, were, if they were identified young, were raised with the ideology that they needed to be fixed, often in ABA frameworks or special education frameworks, which are situated within ABA, and that it was their job to constantly accommodate the environment, and that if they fell short of accommodating the environment, that they weren't doing it right. The second case is that we have late identified neurodivergent people who masked their entire lives and now understand there's something different about themselves, but they still don't feel cohesion. And so they still feel like they're out of sync with everything all of the time. And that somehow is their own fault. And they're trying to put together, what does it mean to be neurodivergent? What does it mean to have this whole life behind them that felt integrated? And oftentimes in both of these cases, it leads to self-pathologization. Even if you're trying to tell the employee, this is neuroinclusive, you're not wrong, we can find accommodations, there's a huge struggle not to internalize shame, grief, and punishment sometimes around any shortcomings. Furthermore, the last thing I'll say about this all is that, our systems of neuroinclusion have gaps. They don't guarantee belonging. They don't provide systemic inclusion. You may have a corporate entity buying in, but it doesn't mean that all of the colleagues and coworkers understand neuroinclusion. It doesn't mean that you're not getting weird stares when you become situationally mute during a sprint call or a check-in or you stutter. And so they're still getting subtle messaging that something about them doesn't fit. And it, in my opinion, prevents a cohesive sense of self and confident, strengths-based self within the workplace.
Super interesting. Thank you for walking us through all of that. A lot of different areas, and I want to maybe dig into each of them a bit individually. So, the first scenario or subgroup that you pointed out was maybe the early diagnosis type of life experience, where I think, yeah, understandable to as long as you can remember a sense of self, it has carried a label that even if you're in an educational and home environment where you're encouraged and given high expectation, high potential, like that label itself, you look it up, and most oftentimes in a medical definition, it's going to be barrier oriented rather than strength oriented. And so, yeah, it's unavoidable in this world to not come across that as some component of sense of self. So I definitely get that challenge, and that gets reinforced by, I think, even well-meaning things like providing an IEP, right? That's there to help you achieve, but in doing so, it often is all about identifying barriers first. And it's like self-centered barriers, not environmental barriers usually. Yeah, I guess with that, it's fairly easy to understand the kind of psychological baggage that one is working against. And this might be a tough question to answer, but just where do you go from a coaching perspective to try to help somebody push back against 20, 30 years of getting that pushed upon them and trying to reframe their own perspective of themselves, perspective of identity from a more strengths-based perspective?
Yeah. Early on, my approach was really to lean into the strengths-based concept.
Mhm.
And positive self-identity was something that I, you know, I still value a lot, and I think is the ultimate goal. And at the same time, my team lead here, who I work with, was really, we met early on and they reminded me that isn't possible for everybody. And it's not fair for everybody to push that kind of gaslighty wellness. Everything has to be good. And they really turned me on to this concept of neutral self-concept. And I think that ultimately that's the first step, is to remove judgment, to help them remove judgment from their actions, and then to frame how it's not wrong and how it's not broken. So some of that is sharing stories about my own life or sharing neutral stories about experiences of many neurodivergent people. I've always loved Barry Prezant's approach, who's an autism specialist, and I think his book is Thinking Differently, but I could be wrong. Anyway, but the point of his book is that really the characteristics in autism specifically that are pathologized are actually characteristics that you can find in almost every child. It's just that the specific presentation or duration of presentation ends up being pathologized. And then once it's pathologized, then every single time the child presents like that, it's a pathologization, whereas other children present in the exact same ways and it's not pathologized. So taking that sort of approach of just, taking a neurodivergent experience and turning it into a human experience, and then turning it into reasons why it's okay to ask for accommodations and why they can be strengths. I like talking about ecosystem approaches because I think that's something that workplaces are starting to move into. And I think culturally it would benefit us to work through this. And I know Dr. Nick Walker talks a lot about this too. A workshop with her where, she said there's a reason 10% of the population is autistic and there's a reason a certain percentage is ADHD. And it's because collaboratively, when we look at ecosystems, those kinds of different ways of thinking are really important and they complement each other. I learned years back, but that dyslexic people have three-dimensional thinking, which is really profound. And we spend all of our time trying to get them to read instead of actually allowing them to innovate in those three-dimensional ways. And so again, teaching the coaches around the importance of ecosystems and how they do matter within ecosystems is important. All of that said, it's a really difficult thing to move out of self-pathologization. And I have to say, it's a very slow moving process and sometimes really heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like something you can only maybe chip away at, or sometimes at best just lean against, because it's so ingrained not only in the individual but in the systems in which they exist, that it's like you as one coach and one coachee are not going to dismantle systemic stigma against insert neurotype here. So the best you can do is maybe just situation by situation reframe how one sees themselves, reframe the even observations they're making of their own performance or of their ability. But yeah, that reframing. And I think you gave a good overview of what does reframing mean. It means looking not at oneself as the problem, but looking at external factors that are at the real root of a problem, which gets touched on in the social model. But as you said, the ecosystem model, I think, takes that further, as well as just the rather well-known concept of the balance of biodiversity in the flora and fauna. And in a smaller sense, the human population has that same thing. And the neurodiversity equates in so many ways to biodiversity, of the variances strengthen the whole. That whether it's a team of employees or 8 billion people on Earth, it's better to not have everybody be the same.
Yeah, I use those analogies in my workshops as well, because even in social justice spaces, it's so valuable. Yeah, and I could geek out, but it's not necessarily relevant to this specific topic. But yes, I absolutely love it. And I think there is a lot to be said about leaning into that analogy, because really we are, a human system is a biological system and we are
Totally.
made that way. Yeah, so totally.
Okay, and maybe this is an addendum, but looking at the other kind of life experience and subgroup that you mentioned, the later diagnosed. And as you were introducing that, I was thinking more optimistically of, oh, maybe that person has already spent 30, 40 years without the label. And so they've created a maybe healthier self-identity. But you're pointing out that they might have just without the label been saying something's wrong. Not this is wrong, but just something's wrong with me. So yeah, how would either the self-identity in particular or your approach to coaching and trying to reframe that differ in a later diagnosed individual?
Yeah. Yeah, it's, as you were saying, what came up a lot, and I have to say it exists in both sectors, but I think it exists more in the late identified group, which is trust in oneself. I find that in the people that maybe were raised with it, they're very self-punishing because that's what the system did to them, having been a young person, because we don't have a lot of respect for young people in our culture. But as older people, they just don't trust themselves because things haven't worked. They followed what they've known to be true, which hasn't been, which as a neurodivergent person doesn't always work in our systems. And then it fails. And instead of blaming the system or understanding why, they just start to blame themselves. And so they have reduced trust in oneself. And then they start to also lose their sense of self because they've spent their whole lives masking to try to keep up. And then once they find out that they're neurodivergent, there's a huge, question mark of, well, who am I? There's a yearning to go back to who we might have been. I was late identified. And I did have one professor that it was a profound moment of my study is phenomenology. And part of that is that we're always changing. Our environment is constantly changing us and we're changing our environment. And so we're never a static human. And that was really liberating of just, I'm never going to find Denielle before, like young Denielle that would have been pristine. Like I would have developed, I would have grown. And I am Denielle who did develop as an autistic ADHD person, even if I didn't know. And it was such a relief to stop looking backwards and just start looking at who I am now and what is my identity now with all of those things in mind. But I do understand that yearning. And I think it's very common of who might I have been had I known, and who am I now? And then as they try to move, there's just a lot of anxiety, a tremendous amount of anxiety and lack of trust in who they are.
Yeah. I hope that our listeners catch the highlight of what stood out to me of what you just said is just moving past the yearning or letting go of the yearning for a fleeting past self, as all past selves are. I feel like that goes way beyond neurodiversity into just something that people, as we grow up, need to accept and be comfortable with. You're given some universal truths that I love there. Thanks for listening to part 1 of our conversation featuring Denielle Rose. Be sure to check out part 2, where we discuss applying these concepts in the workplace through coaching and self-advocacy.